Welcome to the Sky News Daily. I'm Niall Paterson. Today, once again, we are discussing Russia. Now, the Russia files amongst you may well have noticed that last week, President Putin said that any further movement of troops, mobilization of troops, would depend on what his war aims are. He also talked about whether or not Russia would once again try to take Kyiv. His response on that topic? Only I can answer this myself. I clearly hope that that is not the case, but I would suggest that if you are to understand Russia and to understand Putin, then you probably have to spend some time there. So thankfully, that is exactly what our guest has done. Diana Magnay started reporting from Russia at the end of 2013, just of course before Russia annexed Crimea, before becoming Sky's Russia correspondent full-time in 2018. In the last decade, well, she has seen plenty of sights and plenty of changes in Russia. She's in the UK at the moment and here in the Sky News Daily studio. Diana, it is lovely for once to actually be able to say hello to you in person, because usually whenever we chat, it is via tiny little boxes, satellite dishes and televisions.
That's true. You're just a voice at the end of my earpiece normally, so it's great to be here.
But look, Moscow can't have been your first rodeo. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the places that you have reported from, how does it compare?
I mean, I've never reported from another authoritarian state like that. It's totally different. What you have to confront all the time in Russia is the possibility that you'll be arrested and the possibility of what they would do then. And that's the same for journalists. It's the same for the Russian people. You know, it's the law that you're up against there. And that's what makes it difficult to operate in. But the weird thing is, and of course the restrictions have grown, especially since February the 24th last year. But actually, in the day-to-day, you know, people have been much warmer on the streets, even though Britain now, for Russians, is kind of their mortal enemy. They've been warmer to you. They've been more kind of deferential and polite. And perhaps this is because it's quite a reactionary conservative society. You know, in Europe, you get people screaming at you and going, fake news. And, you know, you get that a lot in the States too. And the UK, especially around Brexit. You don't really get that yet in Russia. And I suppose it depends how this all evolves and whether that hostility will really grow. I slightly felt it actually on Victory Day, the first time people were sort of stopping and listening to us and saying, just tell the truth. And, you know, obviously the truth in their eyes is literally the sort of 100% reversal of what the truth in my eyes is.
Victory Day, of course, that's that big parade that they have annually where you see all the equipment and materiel and troops going past. President Putin, of course, front and centre in all of this. And I think to an extent, for many of us here in the West, Russia and Putin have kind of almost become synonymous. I mean, over the decade, did you notice any change in the way in which he portrayed himself, or has he always been, you know, chest out on the back of a horse riding through the river, or has there been a softening at all? He
couldn't really be sort of bare-chested on a horse in this current context now. No. I don't think that would go down well with the general public. I think that we saw this traumatic change during COVID. And, you know, I'm not the first person to say this, but the idea that he kind of went and burrowed himself away in his bunker or in his library and didn't talk to very many people and read a lot of history books and sort of construed his own version of what the past was and what's going on now, I think that had a major impact on him. But he remains, you know, first and foremost a KGB man, and that still absolutely dictates his mindset in terms of perceiving everything as a threat. You know, we love to show those images of him on horseback, of him kind of in all these strange scenarios. You know, these are the pictures that we always would have brought to the fore before when we were talking about Putin. But I think they're the anomaly. You know, he's pretty much a kind of grey man in a suit, and actually he's always been that. At the beginning of his 23-year rule, he was much more open to the West. That he gradually shut down. And here we are.
He may well be wearing a business suit rather more often than the kind of the khakis. But at the same time, I mean, hasn't a large amount of his kind of domestic popularity in Russia, isn't that directly linked to this kind of strongman ideal that he portrays and the Russia that he wants Russians to believe in as well?
Yeah, I think he wants Russians to believe that it is a great country, great power commensurate with its enormous size. And, you know, they can be part of something great. And his popularity comes from the fact that he's pitched himself in a way as a sort of populist. He pictures himself always as listening to the people. You know, that's why you have all these appeals directly to Vladimir Putin. It's as though if you ask Putin to solve your problems, they will be solved, because he's put these mechanisms in place which are then put out on the television, where people believe that, you know, it may not be their regional governor who does anything for them, but Vladimir Putin will.
You mentioned Victory Day, though, and in the past, on Victory Day, people have tended to come out of their houses holding up pictures of their dead children who have served with the Russian forces and have lost their lives in the conflict. That didn't happen this year. Now, for whatever reason, I'm just wondering along this idea that you remain in power for as long as you can, but at certain points you can see your control dwindling. I'm just wondering, does he remain as popular as he once was with your domestic Russian audience?
I think we all wish that his popularity had slipped as a result of this war, but I've just been surprised to see how much Russians have rallied around the flag, how much that propaganda just permeates. It's very effective. You know, first of all, when you turn on state TV, what you see there, it's well produced. It's like 60 Minutes, their main talk show is on twice or three times a day. You know, it's exciting to watch. Mm-hmm. And then there are all these various talk shows where they seed a million different lines that land with people in different ways. And the Kremlin, it's not just what's on television. There are lots of other avenues, through Telegram, through other forms of social media, through advertising, that they seed ideas with people. That means that, you know, the majority of the Russian people can just grab onto something that will make them feel better in an uncomfortable environment, which, you know, everybody now feels, I think, in Russia. That's what I mean by the propaganda. It's a kind of vast panoply of different threads that can appeal to different age groups. It's not just the sort of babushkas who are watching state TV in the regions. It's across the board.
But what though about his control, his grasp on power in Russia at the moment? I mean, you and I have talked about it in the past. I mean, you know, the head of the Wagner Group, for example, operating in Ukraine, speaking with seeming impunity in negative terms about what's going on in the Kremlin. I mean, over the course of the decade, have you seen his control, his grasp on the reins of power there start to loosen slightly?
I don't think Yevgeny Prigozhin is an indicator that Putin is losing his grip. Putin has always played groups of people off against each other because he is scared of anybody becoming too powerful. And I think part of the fact that he allows Prigozhin to basically say what he wants all the time, discredit the Russian armed forces as the only person who is able to, is to make sure that there's a counterweight really to the military, that nobody in the military becomes too powerful. I think that's the only reason why Prigozhin is allowed to keep doing what he's doing, because for the time being, he remains useful.
Is his kind of long-term, well, is his longevity, I might even say, tied inexorably to what happens in Ukraine?
I think so. And I think his own idea of his legacy is also tied inexorably to what happens in Ukraine. And he can throw endless resources at it. I think the problem is that it doesn't matter to Vladimir Putin how many of his own people he kills in the process, as long as, you know, there's no popular uprising, as long as people in the country stay on his side. And he hasn't seen them turn away from him yet. And he's done everything that he can to suppress even the tiniest possibility of resistance. So I don't think he feels too worried about what's going on domestically. I think that there's unease amongst the elites, but they're kind of, you know, they're bought into the Putin project. They don't really have anywhere to go. And as long as he can keep playing off different groups within the security agencies, within the military, within the elites, make sure that nobody's getting too powerful, which he's a master at, and they're all spying on each other, then he doesn't really have domestically much to, you know, threaten him.
Given the place, though, of Ukraine in his legacy, and he can't come away from this with nothing, why did we all get it so badly wrong in the run-up to the Ukraine war? He wouldn't
invade?
Yeah.
I mean, I asked myself this question because I was sure that he wouldn't, that it was all a massive game of brinkmanship. I think we just underestimated what he was prepared to do and at what cost, because this has been a huge cost.
I mean, obviously, Vladimir Putin is an endlessly fascinating man, and book after book after book will be written about him. But your job, of course, as a reporter, as a journalist, is more focused on the day-to-day, and I'm wondering how easy it is to do what you need to do, to get the information that you need, to get the access that you need, to get the contacts within the Kremlin that you might need.
I mean, we don't get much access anymore. There is a daily telephone call with Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin's press secretary, where he does answer questions, which is good. But, since the start of the war, we just don't get officials speaking to foreign media particularly. A lot of the analysts who we used to spoke to have left the country. People on an official level are very scared to talk to foreign media because it doesn't go down well domestically. We can still talk to people on the street.
How's that? I mean, do you need to get permission to do that? Or
No. I mean, you can just go out and talk to people.
Yeah.
People are becoming more hesitant. I think especially younger people in places like Moscow or St Petersburg recognise that if they say something wrong, that could... For example, there was Vox Pops, just talking to people on the street. A series of those were put on the internet, not by us, by a different broadcaster. And then the police came to those people and charged them with discrediting the armed forces. That makes you feel uncomfortable. You don't necessarily want people to say things that will incriminate them. And people are also aware of not saying things that will incriminate them. And I think what's amazing is that you can still find people who are brave enough to speak out. And then people are still happy who support the regime to tell you why. And often it's a sort of incredible panoply of different ideas that they have about why what they're doing in Ukraine is justified.
Understandably, the ability of the Western media to operate in Russia is somewhat limited. There is, of course, the prospect of journalists actually being sent to prison. Let's talk a little bit about Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal journalist arrested on spying charges. I mean, that alone is a concerning development for anyone who has an interest in what is going on in Russia.
That was awful. I mean, it is awful. Evan is not a spy. Evan is a great journalist, and it is horrific. And it will be a long time, I think, before Evan gets out, because the government has told us that any kind of prisoner swap would only happen once a conviction has come down, and it will be a closed case because he's charged with espionage, and it will probably take about a year just to get the case to court. So, every minute that Evan is in jail is a minute too long, and it is grossly unfair. And what is so difficult is that we all believed to a certain extent before this happened that for whatever reason they still wanted foreign journalists to keep doing what journalists must do and try and tell the truth and find out what's going on in the country. And this was a red line that has been crossed. All the Russian journalists, Russian independent journalists for investigative outlets like Novaya Gazeta, Dozhd, there were brilliant Russian journalists inside Russia. They're all operating from outside Russia now because they all left when these new laws came into place, banning fake news shortly after the war came out. But foreign journalists stayed. And what's happened to Evan has had a real chilling effect, and it's awful.
It all seems to be part of this continuum of repression, of dissent within Russia. And I wonder also, another name that people may very well be aware of, Alexei Navalny, the opposition politician in Russia himself, who was taken not long, I think, after, in fact, you started reporting for us. There is an example, I think, of an individual who knew exactly what was going to happen to him, but still felt the need to go back into the country to make the point, didn't he?
Yes, and I think there are a few figures who are extremely brave like that. Vladimir Karamurza, who's just been sentenced to 25 years on treason charges, is similar. He didn't need to go back to Russia. Another human rights activist, Oleg Orlov, who ran essentially Memorial, the human rights organization that was shut down just before Vladimir Putin went into Ukraine. He's on trial now for discrediting the armed forces, for equating Russia with a fascist regime, basically. All of them, they could have left the country. But I think their idea, and Alexei Navalny's idea, you can't lead Russian people. You cannot provide an example to the Russian people. You cannot explain to them what their rights are, what they should be fighting for, what freedoms are, unless you are in Russia, unless you stand and fall on your sword. How can you sit in the luxury of abroad and lecture to Russians about what they should be thinking and feeling and doing? And, Alexei Navalny felt he was a Russian politician and needed to be in Russia. That's what Vladimir Karamurza felt too. And it's an incredibly brave, upstanding position to take.
But if you are an opposition leader you also need an ability to be able to communicate with those who are of your view or those who might be persuaded to it. I mean, how are these dissidents able to communicate with people in Russia? You hear use of services like Telegram. I mean, does the internet provide any opportunities to those who would seek to criticise Putin that maybe were not there when you started?
I mean, Telegram is huge in Russia. Everybody is on Telegram. You know, I think the Kremlin's desperately trying to work out how to infiltrate Telegram. Everybody is on it. And therefore, there is a lot of anonymous and interesting reporting on there. And there's, you know, I said that a lot of the good investigative journalists have left Russia, but there are still people working inside anonymously and putting out fascinating reporting. But it's not so much about can dissidents get their message out. It's just more and more that people aren't necessarily listening. You know, the repressions that I've witnessed in the last 10 years since I've been going there are really brutal. You know, people that you've interviewed just one by one end up in jail. It's the same as Belarus. You know, if I think back to August 2020 when we were in Belarus and the disputed presidential elections and people were just being hauled off the street and put in the back of paddy wagons and sent to a Krestina and terribly beaten and tortured. And you know, consistently, those people who we would follow up with, they would end up in jail too, not because of our reporting, but because they stood up against the regime. And Russia always tried to be a little less like that. Putin didn't want his system to look quite as brutal and oafish as Lukashenko's, I don't think. But it is getting there. You know, the protests at the beginning of the war period, I couldn't believe the number of police out on the streets. People would just be hauled off for walking past and taken off to police stations. So he's managed very effectively to crush all protest. I mean, Russia, the Soviet Union as well, had this capacity to just sort of expel in huge belches the intelligentsia, people who are against the regime. It's not a new thing now. It's been going on for a long time.
Having spent 10 years, you know, living alongside ordinary Russians, how has that affected your view of the West? Listening to their view of the West, I wonder. I
think that in Russia, I've been around people who have been fighting for things that we take for granted here. I mean, it is a cliche, but, you know, I look around London now and everybody's sort of coming back from a Harry Styles concert and having a lovely time. And of course, there are a lot of problems here, but we don't have to fight for very simple freedoms. We don't have to be scared of what we say. And we don't have to be accused of being, you know, a terrible people because we didn't have the courage to stand up and do something. I mean, I think it's really rich to accuse the Russian people of having done nothing. You know, when I walk around Moscow now, I think of every corner where I've been at another Navalny demonstration. People have protested there for such a long time and it has got them absolutely nowhere. And I kind of think people in the West need to take that on board. Yes, it's disappointing that such large numbers have bought into this war in Russia. And that goes back to the way they've kind of accepted state authority since Soviet times, since imperial times. And there are a million different factors that go into that. But there were brave people who tried to do something about it, and there still are. And I think people in the West sometimes need to realize that they're very lucky.
Well, let's flip that question on its head then. Whenever you are outside of Russia, do you miss it?
Yes, because Russia has a strange capacity to kind of get inside you. And Moscow is an amazingly beautiful city, I think. And there's a lot going on there. And somehow it gets to you, but then it sort of chews you up and spits you out, I think. It's a strange place. And I hope that there is a way of distancing Russia and its history and its culture and all the wonderful things about it from this hideous war.
A strange place, perhaps, but one made all the more understandable by the work that you and your team have been doing over there, Diana. So thank you very much, and thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And that is your lot from The Daily for today. Thanks, of course, to Diana. This episode was produced by Rosie Gillott. Our editor is Paul Stanworth. We'll see you next time.